we're super lucky to be joined by Nitesh Gor. Nitesh is the CEO of Avanti Schools Trust, which is a spirituality-based, state-funded education system in the UK. And he's graduated with an MBA from the London Business School. He was even awarded an OBE by the late Queen for all of his services to education. So we're super, super lucky to have Nitesh here. And hopefully he's just around the corner. Nitesh. Can we all just give him a huge round of applause as he comes in? And followed right behind him, we've got Sundar, who is a key member of the KCSOC team here at Cambridge. Sundar is a third year at Emmanuel College studying economics, and he shares the same enthusiasm for spirituality as Nitesh does. So, who better to kind of ask him the questions. And so how the day will work is Sundar will ask Nitesh questions in an interview style for around half an hour, and then we can open it up to the floor, have a Q&A session for around 15-20 minutes, and as always, there's free food at the end. So, I'll pass it over to you, Sundar. Take it away.
Can you all hear me? Is that okay? Okay. So, before we get going, I just want to give a little introduction to Nitesh. Correct me if this is wrong. How many of you have heard of the Bhaktivedanta Manor before? Do you want to put your hand up? So in 1994, the government put a thing out saying that the manor should be closed down for various reasons. And our esteemed speaker here, Nitesh, was a very young 18-year-old at the time. Yeah. And he basically thought, no way the government's going to close my spiritual sanctuary, and decided to create a spiritual revolution of young people. He got together a team and encouraged them to protest, and was able to actually bring together so many people outside Westminster to actually listen. And in the end of the day, through a lot of the work that Nitesh and his group did, they actually stopped the closing of the temple, and that's why the Bhaktivedanta Manor still exists to this day. He then went on to, for briefly, study medicine before he left, which we'll talk about in a minute. And he started a youth group called Pandavasena, where spirituality can be explored for people who are in high school or in lower school. He then did a variety of educational projects after his son was born. So the easiest way of explaining this was he had a kid and thought, I need to make a good school for my kid, and then went ahead and just made an amazing school, which is a pretty amazing thing to do. The Avanti Schools Trust has, I believe, 12 schools, 6 faith-based, 7 faith-based, 5 non-faith-based, but they all revolve around spirituality. And so naturally, we're going to discuss a little bit of what spirituality looks like. What does it look like in a religious setting? What does it look like outside of a religious setting? And how can those principles apply to us here and now? So without further ado, I'm going to ask you a question that a lot of people will have, which is, why is it that you individually have chosen to pursue spirituality?
Why have I chosen to pursue spirituality? I think, well, you mentioned this moment in my life when I was in my first year of med school, and the temple, which, for reference, for those who aren't aware of it, was the temple donated by George Harrison. So it has real substantial kind of relevance and importance. So my involvement with that came out of a kind of an activism type route into it, because it was kind of like an ethical activism type approach to trying to stop what I thought was just plain injustice. But through that process, I think I came across teachings, experiences which opened me up to the notion of actually there's something really important here. more than and beyond just the social good. And so for me, that's what pointed me towards something deeper. And for me, I love philosophy. I like wisdom. I like engaging with that, combined with the experiential aspects of spirituality to make it tangible. And so I think for me, that was really what caught my eye, drew my attention, was the combination of making something, spirituality becoming tangible and practical, something that we can do in the world, supported by a philosophical approach that made sense to me from a cynical, rational mind. I mean, I read many books just trying to find mistakes. Like, that was kind of my approach. So I think those two things in combination were what drew me towards spirituality.
In particular, you talked about there's kind of this theoretical aspect of spirituality, so that's the philosophy, the truth seeking. But you also mentioned that there's kind of an experiential part of spirituality. Now, some people would argue things like, you know, in spirituality, you don't really need to have a good philosophy. As long as it feels good, isn't that enough? Or others would be like, surely as a philosopher, one should seek the truth and make that the most important thing. And so what's the need to have both? Is there a need to have both, or is one better than another?
Yeah, I think unfortunately, a lot of our conversations in society try and dissect things into this binary type of vision of the world and truth and reality. And maybe it's got something to do with computers and whatever it might be, but it goes back, of course, to Aristotelian logic in terms of mutual exclusivity and all that stuff. But essentially, we try and divide things neatly into boxes. I think that that's been one of the real shortcomings in our form of understanding the world, society, relationships, education, everything. I think there is reality very rarely tends towards the extremes, and I think there's often the kind of combination of these things that we can find truth from different spaces, different ways of seeing something. And you can, I mean, that's obvious, even if you look at it from a, you know, there's intellectual types of knowledge which philosophy will help inform you about. But if you think about aesthetics and art and experiences and emotions like love and all of those types of things which are as real as the knowledge we might pursue through a philosophical lens, they are, I mean, I don't think any of us would deny those experiences any more than we would deny the truth and reality of eating food and the experience of that, not being able to reduce that to something which is zeros and ones, right? So there's an experience there. So I think there's a role for philosophy in ensuring that spirituality doesn't just become smoking weed and kind of like, you know what I mean? Like just a really kind of anything goes type approach to life, which is at its root just potentially lazy or escapism, essentially, right? So the philosophy holds that in check. But philosophy is also something which will take you to a certain threshold. Like, it will take you to the threshold, but it can't take you through the door. Like, that requires experience. But it's not that you can go straight to the experience without any philosophy. I mean, you may be able to, but that's a very rare situation. Most people need to go through some kind of form of process to help us be able to think about things, to be able to engage our intellect and volition, to get us to a place where we're actually serious about engaging in some kind of spiritual practice. And I mean, we can probably get into this a little bit more as the conversation develops. But essentially, I think that's why both of these approaches have real merit in terms of a spiritual practice, both in terms of the rational thinking and the philosophy that underpins something and helps us, in the beginning at least, at the very least, to be able to think and understand that here is something serious to look at. Here is something where truth may lie. Here is something where I'm willing to explore further. And experience is important for that, not to become just an intellectual, theoretical exercise, but to translate into something which is real for me and which can benefit the world, because that requires that transition into experience.
I guess a question that we should probably discuss in a bit more depth is then how do you define spirituality? So you've said like, I can't just, I don't know, smoke weed and say, I'm feeling spiritual today. So what is spirituality? Because surely you just said earlier that Aristotelian logic, putting things in boxes doesn't work. But at some point I do need to have something that I can look at and go, that is spirituality, that is not. That's materialism, that's spirituality.
Yeah, and I should have been more clear. I mean, I'm not saying that it doesn't work. Clearly it's worked for thousands of years, right? So like it's brought us lots of amazing things in terms of the progress we've made in science, economics, all of that stuff, right? There's no denying that. It's just that cannot give you the full spectrum of reality. It cannot give you the full picture. So it's limited. And whereas sometimes if we don't recognize its limitations, we can disregard other truths as a consequence of that because it doesn't fit in our box. So back to the point about how do we define spirituality? I mean, the reason why I gave the example, if I can extend the example of the smoking weed one, I mean, I had one experience which is relevant in this, and I kind of talk about it in the book, which was there was a point when I was traveling in India and I became extremely ill. Like, so where I was, you know, I had blood poisoning and septicemia and all that kind of stuff. And I was unaware of that. And in that moment, over those couple of days, I felt like my consciousness expanded. Like I felt like really, really spiritual. And I thought, I've been practicing spirituality for like more than 20 years at that time, 25 years. And I thought, well, how has this happened all of a sudden, right? And I'm so ill and all the rest of it. And it was only until I kind of got on the antibiotics, somebody, you know, luckily there was a doctor in the hotel, they diagnosed me, got me some antibiotics, and I started getting better. It was only then that I realized that actually it was the fact that the blood chemistry and and what was going on in my brain and all of that stuff was so out of balance that it was creating a different experience of consciousness, right? So this was quite an important reflection for me, because I thought, well, is spirituality then just an altered state of consciousness that you can have through drug-induced experiences? And I think that's also one of the things that got me thinking about, well, how do we define spirituality and how do we distinguish it from those types of experiences that, I mean, I've never tried it myself, but people who I know have tried cocaine and they say to me, like, you try cocaine and like expands your consciousness. Like, but there's a sting in that tail in terms of what that feels like, because the way they describe it is that it's a complete expansion of your ego, that you think you're something so immense and great. That was the feeling that they got when they tried those types of drugs. So for me, spirituality falls into four kind of key buckets. One of them is around identity, and I'll keep this brief just so that you know it doesn't stop the flow of the conversation, but I elaborate upon it in the book. So one of them is around identity, and this notion that we all have different layers of identity. Okay, so you have these concentric circles, and if you think about the most outer layers, so if I got you all to think about for 5-10 minutes, like, what are the different things that define you? What is it that you feel that you call your identity, right? So, and then if I ask you to organize those different things that you've written down into concentric circles, what you'd find is that they emanate from something core into increasing levels of superficiality. Okay, and by superficiality I mean either transient or things which are not absolutely core to yourself. Okay, so and that can range everything from, you know, people will talk about stuff like one's DNA all the way through to their work, to their social status, to their personality, right? So
okay,
and
so
you can do that in
something like I'm a student is a very transient part of my identity.
Right.
Whereas if you took my DNA and were to define me that way, that's a lot more fundamental than my studenthood.
Yeah. So so a spiritual process, a spiritual practice is about locating your identity increasingly towards the more fundamental.
Okay.
So that's not to say that we're denying everything that's extraneous. It's just to say that I identify with that core me. Now, in spiritual circles or in religious circles, you might be referenced as the Atman or the soul or whatever it is. From my perspective, consciousness is sufficient for that. So one's about identity, and the practice, or what takes you increasingly deeper into those concentric circles, is a spiritual practice by definition.
Okay, so the first way you're defining spirituality is you're saying there's different layers to identity, and something that allows us to go deeper to the more core part of our identity,
Yeah,
that is the process of spirituality.
exactly.
Okay.
A second piece is about consciousness and levels of consciousness. So now we come to the point of the core being consciousness. Now the second point is around what is it that raises my consciousness and keeps my consciousness raised. Okay, so we all experience fluctuating states of mind, kind of good days, bad days, moment to moment, week to week, year to year, right? So we all experience our best selves, and what we know is we're not at our best. I wish I could have done better, kind of thing, right? So now those practices, those things which allow you to raise your state of consciousness and keep it raised, are spiritual practices. So for some people that's nature and engaging with nature. For some people that's meditation. For some, it can be a whole bunch of different things. But the idea is, what is it that raises my consciousness, and how can I keep it raised?
Okay, so you've defined it in two terms now. You said identity, you've said raising of consciousness.
Yeah.
I just want a small question about this point of raising consciousness. Something like nature,
Yeah.
surely that's an external thing that temporarily raises my consciousness. So is it, when you say a permanent raising, like,
Yeah.
the amount of kindness I have for the world,
Yeah.
what do you actually mean by raising my consciousness?
Sure, but so you're right in the sense that it may feel, at least in the beginning, all of these things, all spiritual practices may feel like they only have a temporary effect.
Right.
That's with anything, right? Like in anything that you're learning new, kind of, we have a learning process that we go through. And whether that's meditation or whether that's walking in nature, the experience is quite similar. That I'll engage in something. In the beginning, it seems quite hard. I have to adjust my way of thinking. I have to get into a certain train of thought before I can get something from it. And sometimes those moments of experience are flickering, and sometimes they're more sustained. And it's through the process, through the practice, which can take years. I mean, there's no denying it, that it can take a long time. But the point about nature, as an example, is that if we observe nature from a spiritual perspective, if we try and learn lessons from nature, if we can engage in observation of the world, one of the Vedic perspectives is that we can understand the spiritual nature by looking at material nature. Like, that's a very profound approach to spirituality. But it requires both some knowledge and technique as to how we can extract that understanding from the ordinary world.
Okay, so you've said two things. You said there were four things in general. So
Yeah.
we talked about identity and raising consciousness.
Yeah. So the third one, I'd say, is what I call buffering materialism. So it's kind of like Stoicism, but essentially trying to create a distance between yourself and the pushes of the external stroke material world, or the materialistic world rather than the material world. So the idea is that, how do I create a separation there? And as Frankl said, this notion of the gap between the stimulus and response, there lies freedom. So this notion of not being tossed about on the waves of life, right, without exercising any free will. So the mind is throwing up a whole bunch of propositions, like constantly your mind is talking to you, like, do this, try that, all of that stuff is going on. What's really interesting is that your free will is exercised not by going along with those propositions, because that's just propositions that are coming to you. Your free will is generally more evident when you say no to those propositions. And that's what I mean by buffering materialism, being able to exercise self-discipline, being able to exercise restraint and creating that separation, that not every, I don't have to respond to every stimulus, right? I can choose not to respond. So that's about buffering materialism. And the fourth one is about connecting to a greater purpose. So like this notion of how do I use whatever I've been given, and how do I connect that with something that is greater than me? So going beyond my own self-interest into a contribution to something greater. And when dovetailed, these four things can form, I feel, create the framework for what can be a non-sectarian approach to spirituality.
Okay, that's actually quite a nice definition. So there's going to one's deeper identity, raising one's consciousness permanently. There's buffering materialism so that you don't act instinctively. And then,
Purpose.
connecting to a higher purpose. So I think that's quite a nice definition of spirituality. I think now if we were to go a little bit more into the kind of misconceptions around those things, one of the things that people will immediately say to you is, well, religion does this. So what is the difference between religion and spirituality? Do I have to be religious to have a spiritual experience? You know, there's this idea of I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. What does that mean? Is that nonsensical? Where does religion come into this? Because religion will tell you that you have some kind of spiritual identity. It will tell you about you engage in certain practices and it's going to help your consciousness elevate. You do these things and you can turn away from the world and you can connect yourself to a higher purpose, which they would call God. So what is religion and what is spirituality?
Yeah, so remember the mantra for this evening can be not necessarily mutually exclusive, right?
Okay.
So we can have religion and spirituality. I mean, the way I like to think about it is essentially religion is the practice and spirituality is the essence. So I don't for a moment think that, that religion is useless in any kind of way. I think it can have immense utility in terms of bringing out and giving framework and structure to the practice of spiritual life, for sure. And the dangers, of course, are in terms of when the externals of religion become the focus as opposed to the essence, right? So, I mean, and that's an obvious point that I think most people would acknowledge. And I think that spirituality, can it be practiced, I guess, is the question, without religion?
Yeah.
Right? So, and here again, I think the important piece is around what is it that we are aiming towards? Do I aim towards the essence, which I feel is defined by spirituality, is that's the space that spirituality occupies? And if I then choose to conform or sign up to a religion, then that's a choice. I don't think it's a necessity in terms of what that might include, because I think different people will have will approach spirituality in individual ways. So the fact, to me, it's incomprehensible that somebody would need to sign up to an institution to be able to access spirituality. It just makes no sense to me. The fact that somebody may choose to sign up to an institution and then access spirituality through that institution makes total sense. But it doesn't make sense to me that it's an essential requirement.
What would spirituality look like for an atheist? So like, I'm a student, I've come today, I'm, so busy with so many things in this world, but I want to go deeper into my life. I want to think about these questions a bit more. But I don't believe in God, or I have no institutional framework to take. What does spirituality look like for me? Yeah, and
this question was one of the questions that led me to write the book, Before Religion, because as you mentioned, in Avanti, we have 5 schools which are community schools, so they don't have a religious designation, and yet they have spirituality at their core. And so it was important for us to think about what does spirituality look like in an inclusive way that's accessible to anyone from any faith or background, including atheists, agnostics, or whatever background they may, or belief system they may have. So I personally have no issue with that at all, because the main kind of focus in my reading discovery of spirituality was through the Vedic texts. And the Vedic texts come from a place of philosophy first, as opposed to religion first, or even theology first. So what I mean by that is that they introduce the concepts, even the book, the Bhagavad Gita, which is like the core text in Hindu literature, Vedic literature. Even the Gita starts with philosophy as opposed to theology. So, and what I mean by that is that it doesn't assume faith, right? So, and that's an important distinction. It's an important distinction in the sense that here is a spiritual text where you are not required to have faith as you enter this, and as you and on the basis of which you can learn from this. So, from my perspective, there's that plays out in a number of different ways, including the acknowledgement that people who don't have a necessarily kind of traditional theistic view on life and the existence of God in the way that God is normally described, have access to spirituality. And in the Vedic texts, that's described in different ways. So one of them is the feature, so material nature. So nature itself and matter itself is seen as a way that one can connect with spiritual life and spiritual practice. Now, whether that's kind of the more obvious ways like immersion in natural beauty, or whether it's less obvious ways in terms of the scientific approach to, in Vedic texts, that's called Sankhya, the going into the exploration of what is matter as a spiritual practice. Mm-hmm. Now, that's really unusual, but very, very powerful. I mean, if we get time to get into it, we can get into that. But and another is, one of the 5 concepts within the Gita is time. Now, again, when I read this first time, I was fascinated. Like, why is time there? You know, as one of the 5 themes of the Gita. But it's incredible because the Vedic texts talk about time as a way in which those people who don't believe in a personal God or a God of any type access their relationship with ultimate reality through the feature of time. And, you know, it was been made famous now by this film, Oppenheimer. You know, like he quotes this, he says, "Death I am, the destroyer of the worlds," or death I become. But the Sanskrit word there is kala. Now, kala actually means time. So the real translation, I mean, you can translate it in the way that he translated it, but you can translate it literally as time I am, the destroyer of worlds. Because what Krishna is saying there in terms of his feature, that's a feature of ultimate reality, which brings about creation. And therefore, even those people who don't have a belief in that theistic form of God can access God or ultimate reality, however you want to kind of describe that, through these features of time, material nature, and other ways of approaching material science.
With this kind of rational exploration, okay, so you talked about something like Sankhya. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know, how many people study natural sciences in this room? Okay, we don't have many. It's just you, Ben. It's okay for someone like Ben, right? Like, I want to learn about the way this world works. Yeah. You do physics. So if I'm sitting there, I'm looking at all these equations. Do you find that quite a spiritual experience? So what does that mean then? What do you mean when you say I'm exploring the world to find spirituality?
I'll tell you a little brief story. So we have a retreat center called the Vedanta.
Yeah.
So 75 acres, beautiful space, right? Lakes and forests and all that kind of stuff. So we do exercises with people to take them on nature walks.
Yes, yeah.
To see what kind of spiritual lessons can they draw from this. And sometimes there are student groups. So we take up Avanti kids on residentials there as well. So I took a group of there must have been 8-year-olds. And we took them on this walk, this 20-minute walk, came back and asked them, what were the spiritual lessons you could glean from your 20-minute experience? And they came up with some really boring ideas. really basic, really bland, really boring. I was thinking that was a waste of time.
Do you have any like examples of what they came up with?
You know, nature's nice, and there was a nice flower, and that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Okay, so then for the next group, we took literally 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, I just asked them to reorient what they're about to do. So they adjusted how they were approaching the exercise, okay? I told them that what we were going to do, what we were going to experience in terms of where we were going to walk, and what I wanted them to think about while we were going on that journey. And it just took whatever it was, 30, 40 seconds. Same exercise, same process, came back, asked them what they found. And I kid you not, the stuff that they were talking about was mind-blowing, right? Talking about the kind of things like, and these, remember, these are 8-year-olds. So, and I found the same thing with adults as well, when we do either adult groups or staff training or whatever it might be, that their experience completely shifts if you just give them some priming towards what they're about to experience. And this is the importance of something like our approach to study, that, and the importance of spiritual knowledge. Because what it helps us do is just to adjust our gaze slightly, just to adjust our mindset slightly in terms of what is it that I'm endeavoring for here. And somebody might argue, because I did to myself, that, well, if you're priming them, they're basically just reading into
So that's
what they're
confirmation
experiencing,
bias.
right? It's a confirmation bias,
Yeah.
right? Like you're reading into what you're expecting to see. But that's actually not what's at play here. So if you think about what's going on, I'm not priming you or those children with what I'm expecting you to see. What I'm priming you towards is a different way of seeing. What you end up seeing then is coming to you. And I think that's the difference between confirmation bias and what's happening here in terms of priming. Like, we're just getting them ready. Like, if you go to a lecture, we found this with students, right? You go to a lecture. I used to, when I was in med school, I used to fall asleep in the lectures, right? So I used to always sit on the back row, and I used to, without fail, I never sat through a single lecture without falling asleep. So at some point, in the second or third term, I thought I have to not fall asleep in lectures. And the way to do that is to sit on the front row. Because if I sit on the front row, there's no way I'm falling asleep and I'm going to be really focused. And I sat on the front row and I fell asleep. So I know that there is an attempt here there is something that we need to do when we bring ourselves to the process of education or in some form of endeavor. And just that moment of 30 seconds. So what we do in some of our classes, what our teachers do is they do 30 seconds of breathing. Okay? Just 30 seconds of focusing on your breath, bringing your mind into focus. And for those children who experience that, it changes the rest of the 45 minutes that follow in terms of their engagement, how much they learn, their experience of it. And that's the 30 seconds I'm talking about. So I'm not talking about feeding information. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about preparing oneself, body, mind, to experience something so that we can open ourselves to that experience.
Okay, that's really nice. In terms of, I just want to get a quick survey in terms of what people study. So how many people here study medicine? Okay, so you wouldn't like that. He dropped out of medical school.
I got kicked out.
How many of you here do humanities or humanities subjects? Okay. How many of you do maths and science? Computer science is included in the STEM basically, outside of medicine. Okay. So a lot of these people, maybe not the humanities, but a lot of them outside of the humanities you would consider quite rational thinkers, right?
What, the humanities are not rational thinkers? Wow. There you go, guys.
Sorry. But like, okay, so we're thinking about things, right? Casey Sock, we're going into deeper questions. Doesn't that just get like super existential? Like I'm thinking about, I don't know, what's after death? How can I think about things, like when I'm meditating, how can I think about things without becoming too afraid of what's there, what's what's kind of unknown to me. That rational approach to spirituality, I think a lot of people that would have tried it, I don't think people are not intelligent and that's why they avoid spirituality. I think people are interested, but it's just scary to think about these bigger questions. How does one go about navigating a rational experience, a rational way of thinking about spirituality without becoming existential?
I don't think there's a problem with becoming existential. I think the problem becomes if your conclusion is nihilistic.
Okay.
So it doesn't. I mean, we don't have to have a nihilistic view on the world. And so that aside, yeah. I mean, what else? What more important thing is there to think about? In the sense of.
But people might have a fear, right? Like, I don't know, so something like death.
Yeah.
Okay. What happens after death?
Yeah.
The scary part is I might get to a nihilistic conclusion where I'm thinking nothing exists after death, therefore nothing in this life matters. And the fear of coming to such a conclusion is sufficient enough to avoid people from going into those existential things.
Yeah, but I mean, think about what you're saying there, right? Or suggesting, like, I would rather stick my head in the sand. No, like, I mean...
But I think people do.
I'm sure they do, but I think look, spirituality is hope-giving. It's not nihilistic. And whichever way one might think about that and approach it, fundamentally, my belief is that spirituality is hope-giving. And the way in which you engage this idea of either rational thinking, I'm not saying that these things need to happen in isolation. So the approach to, for example, Sankhya, or essentially observation, the scientific kind of reductive approach to seeing life, is not something that needs to happen in isolation as part of a spiritual practice. There are experiential things also.
Okay.
I mean, even the STEM people, they might like eating pizza. I mean, that's not necessarily a reductive approach to life, right? I mean, our lives are comprised of a whole. And
Sure.
what's happening, I feel, a lot, is that whole is not really whole, because we focus a lot on the left hemisphere type stuff, the reductive stuff, and we ignore the integrative approach of the right hemisphere. And it's like Ian McGilchrist type stuff, like the idea that life forms its whole, and spirituality is absolutely an essential part of human existence. We cannot explain human existence without speaking about consciousness. And if we're equating consciousness and its discovery and revealing and unencumbering, if we're talking about that, then that is spiritual practice. That is spiritual life.
Uh-huh.
And you can't talk about the human condition. You can't talk about relationships. You can't talk about anything to do with humanity without taking that into account.
Okay, so I'm just going to quickly run through maybe what I think are important spiritual topics, and you can elaborate a little bit on what the Vedic tradition would allow us to think through, the thought process, when it comes to things like one's identity, when it comes to how we experience the world, and epistemology of how we know what we know, and also when it comes to just questions about the nature of reality. So this would provide hope, hopefully, to others of the ideas that spirituality is genuinely rational in its way of approaching these things. So starting off with identity, you talked about how there's different layers to one's identity. So I can identify myself as a student now. Maybe I like rock climbing, so that would be something. I can talk about the sports I like, the current things I'm doing, and those are all on the surface level. Maybe if I go to something like my actual body, so I've been in this body for the last 20 years, although my body has changed, I've always identified with it. So that seems to be a little bit, deeper. That kind of identification, I think most people don't have a problem with. Where can we go on from here? How can we make this jump from I am this body to something deeper with consciousness?
Yeah, the undeniable fact is that you might think about your identification with the body, but moment to moment, from the time you sat down in that chair, your body has changed. So there is no permanence to that identity. Like factually, there is no continuity there. So in terms of how we identify the body versus consciousness is the distinction that spirituality helps us make, even from the mind itself. I am thinking, right? So like who's doing the thinking? So the idea is that consciousness locates that identity at its most fundamental. And that's as I said, the point behind the identity principle is about locating that in consciousness.
You say that this body itself is changing at every moment. What do you mean? Yeah, are there aspects of it that are changing? But like, I don't, in terms of my experience while I've sat here, I haven't felt a necessary change.
No, sure. I mean, there's imperceptible change, right? I mean, ultimately, and this comes to your point about how do we see material nature. The fact is there is nothing that is staying the same. Nothing. So like the difference between, and I mean, this is a really big subject in the Vedic tradition, but it's a fascinating subject. Like, you know, if you think about the wave on the ocean, let's say, to the mountain, and the body in between, the human body in between, like all of these things are essentially transient. They're just functions of time. How transient? But they're all transient. So the Vedas talk about 3 different types of time. So it talks about imperceptible time, which is measured as atomic time. So that's imperceptible, like you said, right? I don't feel like anything changed.
But it happens.
But it's changed.
Yeah.
Then there's normal time, which is like macro level time. And then there's cosmic time. Mm-hmm. So these 3 different types of time, which are, and the two extremes, so the atomic time and the cosmic time, are in some ways imperceptible to us in the sense that they're carrying on, they're happening, and we only realize their effect over longer periods of time, right? So you look at your picture when you're a child and you see, okay, my body has changed. You look in the mirror tomorrow, not really. So and to my point about time, right, as being an important feature or factor in the Vedic philosophy, this is one example of that in terms of how it sees the material nature as being influenced by time and its role in what we see as real. And by real, I mean something that existed yesterday, that exists today, and will exist tomorrow. So something that has permanence. What has permanence? So as we see the world and we observe the world, we see the changing nature of the world. There's one beautiful statement I like in the Bhagavad Puran, which says that this world is a river of names. It's a very poetic section, and I like that framing because it's true. Like what today I call a table, tomorrow will be ashes. Like it's constantly going through motion. So in that sense, what is true? And then as we observe the world, we observe our bodies, we observe nature, we observe the objects in this world, we find that we don't see permanence. Where we do see permanence is in identity, in myself, in consciousness. And therefore that distinction is created between consciousness and that which is inert.
Okay. So if I understand correctly, we have these transient layers of identity, which are kind of like more surface level. Beyond that, we could have like a little bit deeper as the actual body, but even the body itself changes over time and I don't change. And so I can identify with that thing, my conscious experience of the world, which doesn't change, which is beyond the body itself.
Yeah.
So now we're coming to kind of understanding an experience and how we know what we know. The actual picture on the book is kind of an abstraction of an elephant. And something you talk about is the idea of the 6 blind men who don't know what an elephant looks like, but all touch different parts of an elephant and then develop a different idea of what an elephant is. So someone grabs the tail and says, like, the elephant's like a snake. Another person might have the actual body of an elephant and think the elephant's like a wall. Someone else grabs a leg and think it's like a pillar. And so clearly, in their experience of the elephant, they've come to different conclusions. How can they know what the complete elephant looks like? And then how can that analogy be applied to the world? Because you and I, we're only experiencing little bits of reality. How can we try and see a kind of a bigger picture?
Yeah, and the point of that story is essentially that if we are touching different parts of the elephant, and if that's all we know as truth, there's no way I can accept your truth to be the same as mine, i.e. that your experience, your description of the snake does not match my experience of the wall. And therefore, I can't accept that you are actually speaking truth. And this is this brings to focus this idea of how religious traditions that basically just talk past each other because they're experiencing or engaging with such different aspects of truth that they can't accept another's truth. So the point of this idea, the story is that what helps bring about a more coherent understanding and experience and engagement with reality and our ability to understand another person's or accept another person's truth is if we have the concept of an elephant. So if I have and know the concept of an elephant, when I'm touching the body of the elephant and touching the wall and you're touching the tail and the snake, I can understand that actually you are just coming to this from a different perspective. And that's what the Vedic tradition tries to articulate, is this notion that ultimate reality has different features and different people will engage with those different features and spirituality in different ways. And they will come to different experiences and possible conclusions in terms of what that ultimate reality is and how it engages with them. So to your second point, like how do we, what are the implications in terms of us and how can we bring that into the world, is like this is fundamentally the importance of dialogue. This is fundamentally the importance of dialogue intra-faith and interfaith. And this notion that, a single person, and it's true, unfortunately, the message is a little stark, but it's true also that no institution or no religion can claim a monopoly on truth, right? So even though they may try, it just makes no sense. And until religious institutions, spiritual leaders, whoever they may be, come to that point where they are able to let go of having a monopoly on truth, and those people who follow a particular religion are also able to come to this understanding that just because I follow something, that means that must be the absolute only exclusive truth, and only those people in that little or big club have access to that truth. I mean, that's not just a poor way of thinking, it's also a very dangerous way of thinking. So I think that's where spirituality needs that focus, so that we don't just go down a siloed religious understanding of the world.
Fundamentally, the idea that different people can experience different truths without having to be contradictory. You said it requires, in the analogy, the concept of an elephant. So you need a means of reconciling these different things. Let's take the Abrahamic traditions, for example. So Christianity accepts that something like God can take a personal form and enter into the world, whereas Islam would completely reject that. Do you think that, I'm just choosing one example, that's been a lot of tension between those two movements for a long period of time. Muslims criticize the concept of the Trinity and Christians defend it. And so in this way, they have different areas of the truth to do with something beyond our perception that they're arguing with. Will dialogue actually do anything? I'm sure these two groups have been conversing for time.
Yeah.
What will dialogue actually do? How do you develop the abstraction of an elephant?
Yeah, so you see, it's a very fair point. I think the notion of the elephant is there for framing that type of conversation. So the question often comes, like for me, is how first of all, how am I entering that dialogue? Because a lot of the dialogue that I see is more debate rather than dialogue, right?
Yeah.
So like, I'm trying to prove you wrong and therefore prove me right, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thing, and we know where we know it has a place, like it has a role. There's no, I like debates and all the rest of it, but that's not the only way to truth. And often in terms of trying to find kind of truth beyond my current understanding, that's sometimes not a helpful way. So how am I coming to this? Am I open to this notion that actually a religious tradition is offering a perspective on truth? Now, if you think about it from the perspective of a religious text, so a religious text is whatever, 10,000, 20,000 verses. Now, within that is contained some truths, some stories. It's been interpreted, it's been applied, it's been translated, etc. over time. So the notion that these books, these traditions, that no truth or nothing can be seen beyond that, or have no perspective outside of that, is, to me, just doesn't seem to stack up to the world as we know it and see it. I mean, even science is contributing knowledge, right? As we progress, we're understanding new things about whether it's kind of psychology, science, whatever it might be, is contributing to our body of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So, and religious or spiritual experiences will also do that. So you have individuals who are experiencing spirituality in that way. So I think it's, and we also have to see, of course, there are historical contexts within which these religions developed over time.
Sure.
And there were debates within these religions themselves about, for example, your point about the personhood of God and whether or not, all of that. So that has also evolved and changed over time for these different traditions. So it's not that within a particular tradition there is one clear route. I mean, there are many Christians, for example, who don't believe that Jesus claimed he was God. Many. So, so it's not as straightforward as there's direct contradictions between two traditions, and therefore there is a direct claim about the exclusivity of truth.
Okay. So I think that before we open it up to the audience for more questions, we'll move to a little bit more of a practical focus. When it comes to something like, today's worldview, as a student here, I have academic pressures. I have supervision deadlines that I have to meet. I'm sure many people will literally leave this place and go and complete their assignments. So we have academic pressures, we have career pressures, we have social obligations that we have to carry out. Now, a lot of the time when we look at spirituality, we think of people that are like in monasteries or taking themselves away from the world, maybe running to a forest and meditating, experiencing nature. But we can't do that. It's not practical for us to do that necessarily. We can maybe take certain aspects of time out where we disconnect in a meditative experience, breathing, mantra meditation, and so on. But then in the end of the day, you're going to have to go back and do your supervision work. You're going to have to go to work and actually, carry out the tasks that your supervisor's given you. How can one be deeply spiritual while being completely engaged in the world?
So I was speaking about the Bhagavad Gita earlier, which is kind of a core Vedic text. And what's fascinating is that the Bhagavad Gita was spoken on a battlefield. So Arjuna, who is the person who prompts that conversation with Krishna, he had a few more pressures than you all have, even at Cambridge. So he's at the threshold of this huge war. And the point of that context is the point that you're making. The very point of the Gita being spoken on the battlefield is that you can practice spiritual life, you can practice spirituality anywhere, even on a battlefield. So the point, but I don't mean to minimize what you're saying, because I totally accept it, right? I totally accept the fact that all of these pressures bear down on us, and they draw us away from some of the things that we might want to focus on, like spiritual life. But that is where the practice of spiritual practices come into play, because I do really strongly feel that it is the collective endeavor across these different aspects of spiritual life which make it so powerful and so potent in our lives. So if you were to only do 15, 20 minutes of meditation a day, or 15, 20 minutes of yoga, or 15, 20 minutes of nature walking, or whatever that might be, if that was all you were to do and you were to ignore everything for the rest of your day, the impact for you would be lower, because you're doing it for a very finite period of time. You might have some peak experience at that moment in time, and then it just goes back to normal. But the amazing thing about spiritual practice is that it has application in every single thing that you do. So the food that you eat, the way that you eat it, what you're thinking about when you eat it, what you're studying in terms of not the subject, but in terms of how you're approaching that subject, how you're approaching the end goal of that subject, how what is your motivation behind studying, and then the consequence of that study and the outcome of it, what you're doing in terms of your relationships and your conversations and all of those types of things. Each of these areas is fundamentally, it's all about a shift in consciousness. That's all it is. It's all about a shift in consciousness. It's not about necessarily doing something different. It's about doing it with a different mindset, doing it with a different state of consciousness, doing it differently, as opposed to doing something different, right?
So the actual activity is the same.
It's irrelevant, I mean, barring silly things, right? Like, I mean, to get into, but obvious things that
Okay.
one should not do,
Yeah.
immoral, illegal, etc., etc. I'm talking about within the context of normal activity. It's irrelevant what you are doing, right? As far as meditation and spirituality, there may be some things which are in the beginning stages of spiritual practice are helpful and more conducive to calming the mind. Essentially, that's what they're doing. They're just calming the mind. So there are some things that you will find different people will find work for themselves to calm their mind. But all that is opening the door, priming yourself for a spiritual practice. That's not the goal. Just calming the mind is not the goal of spiritual life, right? The actual idea of spiritual practice is to have a spiritual experience, is to get to the level of consciousness. Now, for some people, calming the mind just sets them up, primes them for that experience, for that possibility. But so that's why those 15, 20 minutes of whatever, like I still do 1.5 hours of meditation in the morning, mantra meditation, which sets me up for the day, I feel. So early in the morning, I do that practice. But that doesn't mean for the rest of the day, I'm not trying to practice spiritual life. I try, not to say that I do, but I try to include it and make it the focus of everything that I do.
In terms of those like practical things of actual lifestyle changes, so I don't know how many people here read like self-development books and things, but the first one that came to mind was Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. And his massive thing is like clean your room, right? And there's a bunch of other things like that. But so yeah, we can see that if you're living more regulated, a little bit more disciplined, and things like that, you will see this kind of relaxation of the mind. I know that when I get my supervision work done on time, I'm a little bit more at peace. So I know that these things are there. You've lived in the world as someone that has worked in like very ambitious careers, and you're a CEO now. How do I go from those beginning things of calming my mind to now that I'm maybe studying or I'm working in the real world? How can I actually be very spiritual while doing that activity? Like when you're a CEO, do you actually look at your job and think, like, this is part of my spiritual practice? Are you able to do that? And do you think we can also do that as well?
Absolutely, without doubt. And for me, like, spirituality in many respects wouldn't make any sense if that were not the case. So we all live in the material world. So for spirituality to be practical, real, tangible, not just some airy-fairy in the clouds thing, it needs to be real for me now, not tomorrow. So what does that mean? It means in my context. So whether that's as a student or working, whatever it might be. And to your point about, the cleaning room bit, I've studied through my MBA, management consultancy, investment banking, et cetera, zillions of frameworks. And by far, without a shadow of a doubt, the most powerful framework I've ever come across is a framework called the Gunas, or the three modes, which is what my first book was based on. And this framework provides that structured approach to what I think you're referring to here, is that it goes from, it seems very simplistic, but it's no more simplistic than three primary colors coming together in infinite variety, of going from three different levels of consciousness. And how do we move through those stages of consciousness? And what are the ways that we can think about these stages in a progressive way so that we can increasingly incorporate a high level consciousness into our daily moment to moment lives? So,
Do you want to elaborate on the actual framework of the Gunas in brief?
Yeah, okay, I could try and do it in brief. But essentially, you can think about the bottom, because they are hierarchical. The bottom rung of that ladder, the bottom one is called ignorance. And that is essentially ignorance in a philosophical sense, i.e. the absence of knowledge. And what it then leads to and how it's symptomized. So procrastination, depression, the inability to move on with things, the lack of knowledge, and the uncaring attitude to the consequences of one's actions. So that's ignorance. In the middle is, and remember, think about these as archetypes, three primary colors, right? So then in the middle is passion. So the way ignorance goes is that it's just downhill all the way. There's no upside to ignorance. But then there's passion, and passion is characterized by intense activity. It's like I want it and I want it now, right? And don't get in my way. So and it's about enjoyment, but it's about creativity and that high level of endeavor to get what I want. Now, passion, as you can imagine, gets you instant results, but it also burns you. So it's kind of like an erratic. So whilst ignorance is all the way down, passion is doing this stuff, right? So you get peak experiences and you get the peak lows. And this is the chasing the dopamine thing, right? And then at the top end of that is goodness. And by goodness is like incorporated the conscientious, win-win, long-term as opposed to short-term passion view of the world and how we engage with the world and what we think about as the motivations behind my actions and what it's for. Is it for my own selfish pleasures, as passion is characterized, or is it for the benefit of myself and others in the world? And that's goodness. And goodness is basically interesting because in the beginning it requires some pain. So there's an upfront austerity, there's an upfront sacrifice required in goodness, but the long-term payoff and sustained level of happiness and fulfillment, if you do the integration, so you calculate the area under the graph, despite the upfront cost, is greater than what is included in passion's peak experiences up front and then the later downward trend. So this framework, again, this is like, I've tried to give you a 2-minute version of something which will take many months to really understand fully, but is mind-blowing in terms of its universal applicability, in terms of its ability to help you take control of the current situation, but also help you predict what your happiness outcome is going to be at the end of that situation, right? So not all of these things in terms of their universality and in terms of its adaptability to any situation makes this a framework that is second to none.
Okay. I think just to conclude from my side before we open it up to the audience, if students had to remember just one thing from this talk, so like they've fallen asleep, they haven't heard anything, it's too philosophical, it's too complex.
Should have sat on the front row.
What is one thing that you would tell students to take away from this discussion?
I would say that you cannot explain the human condition or the human experience without acknowledging consciousness. And that means that spirituality is fundamental to reality. And that brings on you the onus to explore it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
so much for that talk. I've learned so much from that conversation. Thank you to Sundar as well for asking such thoughtful questions. I know you've been preparing these for a while now, so thank you as well. Come to the time now where we can ask questions, delve a bit deeper. So, yeah, does anyone have any questions for Nitesh? He's not going to be here every week, so please get those questions in now, if you do have anything. Got one at the back.
I'll say that you can ask like any practical questions that you want as well, because like spirituality, as you said, is not just a theoretical discussion, but also something that like you live and you experience.
Hello. How do you make decisions in the mode of goodness?
How do you make decisions in the mode of goodness? So just to make sure I understand the question, are you saying what characterizes decisions in the mode of goodness, or are you saying how do I get to the mode of goodness to make decisions?
So say in a situation where you need to make a decision, how do you know that it is in the mode of goodness?
Yeah, okay.
And not being influenced by the mode of passion.
Okay, sure. So that's where the framework is really very, very powerful. So the framework actually provides a comprehensive kind of, again, this is like a 2-minute version, but a comprehensive set of criteria so that you can diagnose yourself what constitutes goodness, passion, and ignorance. And then you can apply that to anything. So you can apply it to the way that you, the times that you wake up, to the type of food you eat, to the way that you're thinking about a decision, to the way that you're thinking about whatever it might be. It gives you essentially their archetypes. So and you can apply those principles behind those archetypes to any context. So it's just about learning what sits beneath those i.e. familiarizing yourself with those archetypes, so then you can then apply them in life. And in the beginning, look, it's like riding a bike, right? In the beginning, feels a bit artificial, like you have to try, you have to kind of reset, you have to think about it. But as you become increasingly familiar with them, you don't even think about it. It's just natural. It's the way that you approach the world.
I have one more question. How do you know spirituality is working for you?
Yeah, well, okay. So back to my example, right, of the drug-induced state. The way that spirituality works, I mean, there's different ways you can approach this question, obviously, right? So in the book, I give a bunch of criteria that are like progress checks that you can think about. And that could be things like sustained changes to yourself in terms of your character. So this is one of the litmus tests for spiritual practice. Does it change your character? Does it change the way that you engage with virtues? So sometimes we can think about values and virtues as theoretical, right? So like I have a virtue for empathy, but I have no empathy. I don't practice empathy. So what are the sustained changes to one's character? Not in a way that I just have to do it on endeavor, but actually fundamentally, intrinsically, now I spontaneously or without that structuring are able to exercise that. That's one way. But the way that I love the Bhagavad Purana frames it, there's a beautiful verse there which talks about how when you're eating food, 3 things are happening simultaneously. Okay, the first is that you're feeling nourished. Your hunger is going down and you're feeling some pleasure. Okay, these 3 things are happening simultaneously when you eat, right? So if one of these 3 things is not happening, you have to question, am I eating? Right? So it's the same thing with spiritual practice. 3 things are happening when you practice spirituality. And when those 3 things happen, just like if I'm eating something, I don't have to logically prove to myself that I'm eating, because the experience of those 3 things is sufficient. It's self-evident, right? Because my hunger is going down, I'm feeling nourished, and I'm feeling some pleasure, right? So 3 things are happening when we're practicing spiritual life. One is we're becoming detached. Just like we're becoming less hungry, we're becoming detached from materialistic things and yearnings. We're getting some pleasure. We have some experience of spiritual nature, of consciousness, okay? And I'm being nourished. That my engagement with spiritual practice is strengthening myself in my identity of consciousness. So these three things become self-evident. They no longer become something that I need to prove to myself or the world, because they are self-evident to me. It's my experience, just like eating food is my experience. So I would say that that's an important feature for us, and that, sorry, just to end here, like this one point, that also acts as a really helpful buffer to religion, as a side benefit, to religious fanaticism. Because what can happen with religious fanaticism and engaging with the religion is that I believe it because the book says so, but I don't relate it to my human experience. I don't relate it to what's going on inside of me. I don't relate it to any of that stuff. I just believe it, and on the basis of some external, extrinsic, whatever thing that's going on here. So it can also help calibrate our engagement with religion, because now all of a sudden it's not just about you belonging to some institution or you following some book. Now it's about, what is your experience?
Thank you.
I think we've got a couple of questions here. If you could just pass the mic down.
I wanted to say thank you for the talk. It was very insightful. When it comes to spirituality and spiritual experiences, I wanted to ask, are spiritual experiences necessary for everyone? And if so, what benefits do they entail in the after effects?
Okay, great. Thank you. That's a really helpful question. I would say yes, they are necessary. If you're practicing spiritual life, they're necessary. But I'm not talking about like visions and floating above the ground. And I'm not talking about that stuff, right? I'm talking about spiritual experience in the sense of one's feeling situated in consciousness. The experience of contentment as opposed to happiness. The feeling of being able to experience raised states of consciousness for increasingly sustained periods of time. I'm talking about those types of experiences. Now, obviously, there may be peak spiritual experiences where, the clouds open and whatever, right? So something might happen. I'm not denying any of that. Maybe it does. But I'm not talking about that as a requirement. I am talking about the requirement of locating one's identity and consciousness, engaging with the world in that way, being able to see, for example, the equality of spiritual identity within all living beings, right? Being able to see the world in that way and engage in the world in that way. These are experiences which I think are essential, not because, because they are accessible, they are on offer on every bona fide spiritual path. Otherwise, what is that path offering? If it claims to be a spiritual path, what is on offer if it's not that? And if we are not experiencing those things, then just like my example to our friend at the back, what am I doing? Like, what exactly is going on in terms of my practice, my mind, my engagement, myself, my consciousness? If I'm not experiencing those things, am I really eating? If my hunger is not going down, what am I doing? Right? Like, surely the process of eating means that the inevitable consequence of that is that my hunger will go down. So the inevitable consequence of a spiritual practice, a genuine spiritual practice, and that's why this threshold, this criteria is so helpful, because what it helps do is it helps us identify that maybe I'm doing something wrong here. Like if I'm just taking some substances, like as my practice for spiritual life, and I'm doing something, whatever, and I'm not experiencing all of these things, then maybe I'm doing something wrong. So yeah, I do think this is an important criteria, and I think it's something that we should hold on to.
Just, would you mind passing the mic? Yeah, just there. Thank you.
Thanks, Nitesh, for the talk, and thanks to the Society for organizing this. I'm reading finance at Judge Business School, and my question for you is revolving around that. In Indian philosophy, two of the four pillars of life are artha and dharma, which is wealth and ethics. traditionally, wealth was supposed to be acquired in a way that not just focuses on your personal well-being, but society at large. But in today's world, where profit maximization is at the peak, everybody is all into speculation, greed. Do you think Artha and Dharma can be balanced? Are they even supposed to be balanced together? And just to add on to that, we are being taught the idea of inclusive capitalism these days. Do you think having a good spiritual quotient can further enhance that?
Yeah. So what struck me when you were speaking was you said the two core principles are Artha and Dharma. But the way it's stated is Dharma and Artha, right? So Artha and Dharma means first comes wealth and then comes principles. But the actual way it's stated is Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. So Dharma comes first. If you have Dharma, then you get proper Artha. And if you get proper Artha, then you get proper Kama, and then you get Moksha, right? So the point, it's actually an important point here. I'm not just being silly. The point I'm trying to make is that Artha, opulence, or you can call it wealth for shorthand, but the idea of Artha, something that has value, right, is not just defined monetarily. Like Artha, real Artha is something that can be used for good, for one's own good, one's own benefit, but also for the world. That's how Artha is defined. And that comes from living a life of principles, Dharma. So if you live a life of principles and you engage in commerce and finance and all of these things for wealth creation, which, I mean, my first book was called The Dharma of Capitalism. The reason why I wrote that was I was doing investment banking at the time. We developed the Dow Jones Dharma indexes, which was the first financial platform or equity indexes screened on a dharmic principles. And the point of that endeavor was to say that capitalism, wealth creation, has a place in the world, right? Like there is no problem with wealth creation. The problem is when we forget what it's for. So when we disassociate Dharma and Artha. So the point is that we want Artha, but we want it in a dharmic way. We want it based on principles. So yeah, like this is a big subject, but if I help, hopefully can make sense of it in short. I talked about those three steps, right? Ignorance, passion, and goodness. And I talked about how those three things can be applied to anything. And let's apply it here, because that's what I do in the book, is like, I use the framework of those three modes of material nature. You can look at capitalism from the perspective of passion. Now, what does capitalism look like from the mode of passion? It looks pretty much like what we've got going on right now, right? So it looks like very erratic results. It looks like a lot of extreme pain and a lot of extreme pleasure. It looks like very disassociated and disproportionate wealth distribution. It looks like all of those things, right? But that's not wealth creation in the mode of goodness. So how do we recalibrate our approach to wealth creation in a way that it doesn't deny the individual's endeavor towards wealth creation or the fact that some people want wealth more than others, but it does it in a way that is much more long-term thinking as opposed to the short-term erratic nature of passion, and that's through the lens of the mode of goodness. So that's what I attempt to do in the book, is trying to say, how can we look at capitalism through the mode of goodness in order to try and achieve that? And I'm not saying that that's an easy thing to do. It's definitely not an easy thing to change in society, but ultimately, at the end of the day, even if we're changing one person, that's a start, right?
I think we'll have one more question there. Just behind.
Nitesh, thank you for the talk. My question's on purpose. What would you say purpose is, and how would you say we go about finding what our purpose is?
Yeah, okay. I get this question a lot in terms of the fact that many of us struggle to find our purpose, and we spend a lot of time thinking about purpose, and it's become like a buzzword now, just in terms of what's my purpose in life and all of those types of things. And it can become quite limiting, and as you were kind of alluding to earlier, like the potential of it becoming a little bit too existential. So I prefer to take a practical approach to this, in that my long-term life's purpose may not be obvious to me right now, right? But what I can do is engage in things which I know are beneficial and progressive. And through those engagements, which may not be the thing that I want to do for the rest of my life, or dedicate my life to. But through those different experiences, I will learn something about myself. I will learn something about myself and contribute to society at the same time, right? And that will open my eyes to what comes next. So the decision, the kind of, if you think about it like a decision tree, right? Like you go down a certain path and then a different set of options open to you that were not open to you at the beginning step. Now, so I would say that it may not be mind-blowingly kind of like easy and straightforward, and you kind of like have an epiphany or a revelation about what your life's purpose is. For most people, that's not what happens. Most 17, 18-year-olds are doing their A-levels, picking their uni degrees, having no idea what they want to do in their career, right? So it's something, but that doesn't mean that we don't endeavor. It doesn't mean that we don't walk down the path and get involved and contribute and learn something about ourselves. And that will hopefully give us greater and greater insights into what my particular skill set are, what I like, what I don't like, and help to evolve in my own mind what is my purpose and how do I engage with it. And we don't have to be so worried about that purpose being fixed. Like, it's okay. Like, my purpose can evolve over time. Like, if I could have a central thing about, you know, I want to be a spiritual person, I want to kind of like engage in spiritual practice as an example, but what form that takes, you know, is it a problem if that changes over time? I don't think so.
We're going to have one last question here, and if anyone else has any other questions, I'm sure Nitesh can kind of talk individually after. Yeah, if we just pass that mic down here, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi Nitesh and hi Casey Sock, and thank you so much for the event, because I quite find like all these discussions very interesting, but I am not able to see such kind of discussions these days. My question is about about the three gunas that you mentioned. I frequently come across another concept of like overcoming all the three gunas, because even if I am in one guna at one point of time, I keep on jumping between like the other, like I'll go into the other one, and then I'll have some beatings in my life, and then I'll come back to the other one. But there's another concept which kept me in confusion, is like, can you overcome all the three? Is it something like which exists?
Yeah. Okay. So just to clarify for those who didn't catch the question, because you used the word guna, which is a Sanskrit word for the modes of material nature. So ignorance, passion, and goodness. And the question is, can I go beyond goodness? Essentially, can I transcend these three modes, right? And the short answer is yes. I mean, that is the whole notion of the gunas. So the whole notion of the gunas is that not that we stay within the cycle of the three modes, or that we just get to goodness. Actually, the notion is that they are used progressively, hierarchically, to a point that goodness gets us to a state where we can practice spiritual life really intensely and very potently. So spiritual practice can be done at any of those modes, but it becomes very potent at the mode of goodness. And then when one practices spiritual life in the mode of goodness, that is essentially the springboard for being able to overcome the three modes in their entirety. But, you know, these are kind of quite elevated states.
Yes, I mean, I think that pretty much answers my question. Just one last and small thing, since you answered about the purpose of life. Like, I was just thinking, like, since we all as students are kind of trying to find the purpose in terms of this materialistic views. Okay, I want to do something. I want to do something else. But at the end, like, will it be like okay or conclusive to say that the purpose is all about like finding the inner self, or something which all the questions that we want to answer, or what you're trying to say is consciousness, So is the purpose for every single person, like on the earth, is to understand the consciousness through various ways?
Yeah, so I guess we can think about purpose in different ways. So in the way that I was thinking about it earlier was a more earlier stage purpose, i.e., contributing to a purpose greater than myself. So, like being part of a greater purpose, as opposed to the purpose that you're talking about, which is essentially the fundamental purpose of spiritual life. Like, you know, the Brahma Sutras say, now therefore inquire about the truth, right? Like this idea of that you've come to the human platform, you've learned all the rudimentary stuff, now inquire about something permanent, the self. So, yeah, fundamentally, the purpose of human life is can be framed as the purpose for spiritual exploration, the purpose of identifying who am I, right? So, yeah, you can frame it that way. I guess you can just use it in different ways. Like somebody might be thinking, what's the purpose of my life? What do I do? What do I practically do in the world?
Thank you so much.
Can we all just have a huge round of applause again for Nitesh?